Thank you. Good evening. And we're going to talk about, as the title says here, Hindostan, Bharat or India. What basically it's saying is that there have been, India has been in the news from a different angle in the last few months. From what happened in Delhi regarding the rape, and then in the last few weeks regarding Afzal Guru, the hanging, which has to do with the death penalty issues. Human Rights Watch has been talking about it from a different angle. The elections are coming up, so political parties are presenting what's happening in India as to why they're doing what they're doing. I thought maybe this would be a good topic to talk about what really is happening in India since 1947. So this is sort of a brief review of a minority angle. And when I'm saying minority, I'm looking at gender minority and ethnic minorities as well as religious minorities. So other than the majority culture, majority organization or majority people there, how are the minorities perceiving this? So that's what the agenda is going to be. A little bit about the map I put up here. If you look at this is a South Asian map obviously. So every colored area on the map, it says this is where the conflicts in South Asia are. It's very interesting for me to look at this because if you look at Punjab, as most Sikhs would say, well, we don't think the conflicts have been resolved, but they actually, that area is presented as being there is no conflict. This map is drawn by a so-called think tank in New Delhi, which is headed by KPS Gill. And this is drawn in March 2010. So according to that organization, which is a consultant to governments, including in the West, the troubled areas in South Asia, basically they're saying, except a little bit in the south and a little bit in the northwest, every other area is a troubled area in India. So even if we go by their assessment, there are, Sikh biases aside, there are some major challenges going on. Who's asking those questions? How do we look at those challenges? The agenda today is not to really get into subjectivity from the angle of what do I think of India, but to present India as it's seen by the world. How does the World Bank look at it? How do the minorities look at it? How does the minority leadership look at it? And I want to rely more on the data today rather than, and I'm not discounting the personal testimonies of the communities. We can get into that if you want a little later, but the more sort of the approach on how the world is perceiving India. Some of you maybe saw the article in New York Times yesterday, written by an Indian professor from New York, and one of the things they mentioned was that there's a Journalists Without Borders, and they did a freedom index on freedom of speech, and India got a rating of 140 out of 179. What that means is Afghanistan got a rating that Afghanistan is more free than India in terms of press. Now, which should make us think of it, because sometimes we have our own notions of what's going on based on if you just visit your relatives in India and have a dinner at Bukhara. That's not the point here. The point here is to look at, in that republic, what opportunities exist for Indians at large, 1.2 billion people, and those of us who are concerned with India, what can be done to fix things there if they're interested, and what are some of the apprehensions by minorities, and what are some of the potential probable solutions. With that, I'll talk mostly about the statistics and raise some questions and talk about some of the trends. And what I mean by that is that not, for example, what the Sikhs are saying or Muslims are saying or what women are saying or what Dalits are saying, but rather those who study these things, what are they saying? So that's what I meant, that I don't want to get into us versus them kind of an idea. It's more about, as a republic, what are the major challenges there. Little bit come to constitutional angle of it, because I was coming in today and downstairs I noticed there was a bust of Ambedkar. Baba Sahib Ambedkar is credited with creating or drafting the Indian Constitution. And it's very interesting. Indian Constitution guarantees lots of different things, and I'll talk about that. But there are certain things it does not guarantee, but even if what it guarantees, in implementation, the institutions are not able to do that. So that seems to be a major thing. So the irony is that Dr. Ambedkar drafted the Constitution, But a lot of people don't know that very soon after that he had to resign. Not he didn't have to, he chose to resign because India was about to have its first free elections. The Jawaharlal Nehru, those of you know, was the first Prime Minister of India, but he was not the first elected Prime Minister of India. After 1947, he became Prime Minister by the internal voting of the All India Congress. Even that voting he lost actually, he only got one vote, 19-1. But because of Mr. Gandhi, it was advised that he be made, otherwise he was going to go to the British to make sure there would be no independence. There's a whole historical evidence available for that. But when the elections were announced, there was supposed to be a reorganization of the, what they call the Hindu Code of the Hindu Bill. And that debate was occurring on Indian Parliament regarding that. And that debate was floored, it was filibustered as what we call in the West. And after that, Dr. Ambedkar, the guy who drafted the constitution, ended up resigning. When he died, the first Prime Minister, then Nehru won the election, and after that he died of some natural causes. And just to put it in context, this is what Mr. Nehru, the first elected Prime Minister of India, also said. On his death, he said, you know, Dr. Ambedkar represented, in his eulogy he said that, Dr. Ambedkar represented all how to confront the oppressive elements of Hindu society. So the reason it's important is, people who are working on this issue, constitutionally speaking, were very aware of what are the problems in terms of rights problems, who gets to have more rights and less rights, things of that nature. We talked about the remedies, and because, you know, a lot of you are Sikhs here, and I'm also Sikh, and there's a stereotype about that Sikhs just end up fighting for no reason. And you know, there's a stereotyping of that as well, especially in the post-80s phenomena. I want to talk a little bit about that, as to why Sikhs fight this issue, not from 80s or now, but this has been the issue in the Sikh fold since 1947. So you know, it's not something which happened because of a particular militancy movement in the 80s. There was a reason why Sikhs have been objecting to certain things within the Republic of India. Okay. This is a Google thing, you can look at it, but I sort of like it because the strength of India as it's presented most of the time is diversity. But and you know, the Google is playing with that. They put this up on 26 January, which was the Republic Day of India. And obviously these are symbolisms of various religious traditions in India. But the question is, where have they used this religious diversity for their benefit? Have they really dealt with these diversities in a manner so they actually can become the model for the world? And those are the kind of questions being raised by some of the sociologists and social scientists these days. I know it's a long quote. In the interest of time, if you want to read, why don't you take 30 seconds and try to read this? And maybe the better way to do is, can somebody volunteer to read this? Somebody who had early dinner? Anyone? Go ahead. Are you doing it? Oh, I thought you were clearing your throat to do it. Go ahead, thank you.
The whole thing, yeah?
Sure.
Okay. The Republic of India is today only a union of nations, not a nation state. Nor has India ever been a nation state in its long history, because we have never had basic elements, common history, religion, language, culture, and ethnicity, essential to forge national unity. In fact, India has no stronger basis for national unity than Europe has. It has less basis, really because of its greater diversity.
It is.
It is today politically fashionable to speak of certain community and its culture as truly Indian. But the fact is that there is no pure native Indians or any pure native Indian culture. All Indians today are descendants of migrants or invaders. So what defines an Indian today? Certainly not any ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or historical distinctiveness. Later there came into existence for short periods a couple of pan-Indian empires, like those of the Mauryas or the Mughals and the Mughals. But these were established by conquest and not by any national integrative process. Even the political unity that India enjoys today is the result of conquest, the British one.
Thank you. So, At the onset, what I want to talk about is, and this is where the quote is quite relevant, is a lot of people have issues with India. Sikhs have it, Muslims have it, women have it, and we'll talk about some of those things a little later. What we really need to understand is the symptom of it. What's the root cause of it? And one of the things which I'm agreeing with, that's why I'm sharing this quote, is India actually hasn't had what Abraham Early is saying, a national integrated process. What that means is an average Indian has not participated in making India India. It has been the elites who have been running it. Even when the British left it, it was the elites of all Indian National Congress, they called it at the time. Or when you look at the civil servants, and if you look at the statistics of those, who really runs those, who is the judiciary? And these are the questions being raised even this week. If you look at, what Amitabh Bachchan had to say, for example, regarding Afzal Guru's hanging, versus what Arundhati Roy had to say. And the questions are being raised on not just the process, but, should this have been done? And why was, even if the judgment was passed 6 years ago, why did it take him 6 years to hang him? Why was there a delay? And potential things are coming up that because there's election here, and there's a lot of electioneering going on. And maybe it has something to do with it. The point this slide is raising is that in order to create whatever it means to be an Indian, I'm sure there are campaigns, Incredible India campaigns, you've seen them, but from a people's perspective, there hasn't been a national integrated process. The Bengali tradition started something like that in the 1870s, much before British left, but it never became a national movement. It actually became a Bengali movement. That's why you have, even in today's India, rise of regional parties, what they call it. The national parties are kind of disintegrating again. And that's why there have to be alliances in order to form governments with the regional parties. And regional parties are what? Different religion or ethnicity or language or even what they eat and dress. So the point to be raised here is that the Indianness is more of a legal definition rather than a cultural or a religious or an integrated one. And that's why, since it is more of a legal thing, we'll have to look at some of the legal remedies for it, not necessarily the cultural remedies. And I'm not saying other remedies are not needed, but I'll focus more on the legal ones because that's the bent I'm taking. Okay, so let's talk about, first thing is, anytime we talk about India, the first thing people tell you, I'm going to list the strengths of India. This is what you hear about. You hear, if you look at the statistics today, that President is a Hindu Brahmin, Chief Justice is a Muslim, Vice President is a Muslim, Prime Minister is a Sikh, Leader of the ruling party is a Christian, Speaker of the Parliament is a low-caste Hindu, and the most famous war hero India has ever seen was a Parsi. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Look at this. The best India has to offer is a rainbow coalition. It's the people from various religious traditions. So here is my take on it. I want you to think about it, all you are smart people. Just because America has a black president, are you telling me there is no racism? You know that's not true. Again, people who belong to elite classes, they could be from any religious backgrounds. They go through particular training, so they end up the power brokers. And so it's like, in UK and US, this phrase came about last year, 99% versus the 1%. So the question is, what is happening to the 99% of the Indians? So when somebody says, you're unnecessarily making these things up, I'm not the only one. Now there are at least 9 to 11% Indians who are starting to talk about this. That there is something wrong with it. Because elites are running it. Just because religious or ethnic or gender minorities show up on top, that does not mean that average person of that minority is getting the basic civil rights. And that's what's at issue. So sometimes, you see these three monkeys, because the classic thing, hear no evil, and see no evil, and speak no evil. So this one is saying, well, there's a fourth one, it's called admit no evil. So if you don't admit it, you'll never be able to solve it. So is it because of ignorance at large, or is there intolerance, or is there injustice? I'm saying there's a combination of those three eyes going on as well. So just because a particular for example, when somebody says Prime Minister of India is a Sikh, so everything should be okay. Well, here's a case in point. Prime Minister of I mean, the French president is about to go to India. Is everything okay? They still have not allowed turban ban. And Prime Minister of India has not done anything about it as being a head of state, not being that he's a Sikh. Sikhs are not okay. You know, the Sikhs still have a lot of grievances within India. They haven't been taken care of, including some constitutional ones. So having heads of political parties, heads of planning commissions, becoming a general, becoming a president, like they have, you know, under BJP, the president was a Muslim guy. And look what had happened under BJP earlier. It's not to pick on that party. Under Congress, something else had happened. Just because a ceremonial head sits does not mean everything is okay. That's my point here. So this is a great ceremonial thing to showcase to the world. But if the average person of that minority community is not being treated equally, that's the issue we need to look at. So let's talk about the whole world, including economists are saying, or used to say 3 years ago, that India is a tiger economy, everything is great there. Well, economists last year changed their thing and they said actually it's an elephant economy. It's big, it moves very slow though. So I don't know if you looked at recent numbers, here are some of the numbers. Human Development Index in the world for India is rated 132nd out of 179. What that means is, if you, Indian government's own statistics say 68% of Indians live below poverty line. That's what this means. Which means an average Indian, this has nothing to do with their background yet, average Indian is going through this. Global Hunger Index, 65 out of 100 countries. World Bank's ease of doing business, which has to do with enforceability of contracts. A lot of companies were opening their businesses in India. A lot of them are starting to leave because of this reason. Ease of doing business in India is rated 132nd out of 185. Index of Economic Freedom, you can look at it. UNESCO's Education for All, 107 out of 127. Corruption Index, India is rated 95 out of 182. These are the numbers which the business world is presenting or the development world is presenting. And to put it in perspective from Arundhati Roy, she says, and this picture is very good actually. What she says, yeah, there are actually, don't think India is all hunky-dory. There are two Indias going on. And what are those two Indias? And she's actually saying they're driving in opposite directions. And what are the opposite directions? One is the glittering destination, while the rest of them went into darkness and disappeared. And this picture speaks to it. Within a half a kilometer, like when I go to Delhi, sometimes I go there for lectures or okay, said India Habitat Center. I see this. Within half a kilometer, there's Maharani Bagh, where the richest families of the former prime ministers stay there. And within 3 blocks, you'll see this, where the poorest of the Indians live. Arundhati Roy actually was on Charlie Rose. He is one of the best interviewers, in my opinion, in the world. And he asked her, can you describe to me what is India in one line? You know, to give a 1-hour lecture is easy because to say something in 1 line begs an hour. I really liked her response. She said, India is a country which lives in several millenniums at the same time. It's true. That's what's going on. You will have, some of the guy I stay with in Delhi in Defense Colony, he has the newest television 3D smart TV set before I would ever have it in America. But guess what? People who work at his house, they still don't have the basic rights. I mean, you name and they're violated. And that's what's being discussed here, that average Indian doesn't have those rights. So yes, India is doing great from some of the... by the way, I have a high recommendation. If you want to understand intricacies of how India operates, it's written by one of its own IFS officers. And in fact, you guys gave him a Booker Man of the Year prize 3 years ago. The book came out, it's called The White Tiger. I highly recommend it. If you want to go beyond the propaganda wars from left and the right, and look at and understand how the system works, the politics, the banking, the home even. He brings it down to how things are operating between a servant, a driver, and the owner. It's that detailed. It's done. It's a remarkable book. Anyway, so the point is, yes, there's a lot of development. There's a lot of modernity coming across. But actually, when you look at it in a simplistic numbers game, it doesn't look that great. Then you start to wonder, is this really a modern democracy? Where are the efforts being made? Why are these numbers in the 50 to 75 percentiles where they should be in the 5 to 10 percentiles? Now let's talk about a little bit of religious minorities in India. And most of you will know this, but just for summary purposes, they did have another survey in India, but the results of that survey are not public yet. They were supposed to be public last year. Hopefully they'll come online this year so we can look at the newest statistics. So this data is 10-year-old because this is the newest available data yet, although government has finished another census. So what it shows is roughly there are about 14% Muslims. This is according to government, and I want to deconstruct this a little bit as well. 2.3% Christians, 2%, roughly 2% Sikhs, 0.8% Buddhists, and Jains. These are the major religious minorities of India. Now this becomes interesting. Just keep in mind what this is saying is roughly 82 to 84%, that range, is Hindus. But when it comes to rights, those are further divided. But when it comes to presenting as being majority-minority dynamics, which I want to talk about quickly, India is presented as being majority Hindu community. I mean, nobody can deny this. This, is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic is a country. But mostly, I mean, the Indian states were carved on what they call the language formula of 1951, which basically was whatever the people spoke in a particular area. So if you spoke Marathi, that became Maharashtra. If you spoke Gujarati, that became Gujarat. So it was the statehood in India were actually developed on some natural phenomena, which is language. A group of people who spoke similar languages. Just as a footnote, the only state which was not given a statehood based on the language formula was Punjab. So as an asterisk, just to keep in mind, statehoods were started in India in 1950, Punjab got statehood in 66, and there's a whole lot of things going on between 50 and 66, but the only exception was Punjab. So Sikhs have had issues with the state, even on the linguistic elements. Okay. Now, a few things we need to talk about. Because the census says, let's say 80% roughly, so 4 out of 5 Indians belong to one majority community, and 1 out of 5 Indian belongs to another minority community. There are going to be certain things, certain dynamics we have to understand what's going on here. So one is, Indian Constitution actually does guarantee certain rights to minorities. We'll get into its implementation a little later. So there are some safeguards built into it. I mean, there is a reason why it is called a democracy, and one of them is there are special grants to minority. Problems faced in terms of inclusion and state building. Now this I'm mentioning, this is the experiment of democracy going on in India, which basically means because there hasn't been a nation building, they haven't figured out how to carry along all the minorities to build their status, their leaderships, their needs, their special needs. So when you see, it becomes very easy in India, for example, to make something a religious conflict. That's what I'm trying to say. It might not be religious, it might be purely economic conflict. Even within Punjab, for example, within a state, it might be very economic conflict, but as soon as you start presenting it, people don't understand that, so most of the spinning makes it regarding caste issue or a religious issue. Now there is a reality to that, but because people haven't gone through that integrated process, I'm saying, they look for some simplistic or superficial division to explain what happened. So usually, even the Punjab conflict, it used to be all Punjab conflict. But after 86, 87, most of the books which are written, they say Hindu-Sikh conflict, which is very ironic, which is very funny, but until then it used to be Punjab conflict. Even the Indian government papers used to be white paper on Punjab. They never said white paper on Sikh-Hindu conflict. But there's some strategy change occurred and they start playing the religion card, although it was maybe more of economic or political thing, which the issues were. Okay. You can read those bullets there, but essentially what I'm saying is, let's go to the dynamics. So the major thing what I'm trying to say is that majority community has to be able to, and the minority community, the way they explain their conflicts is more on religious or minority backgrounds, because that's the easiest thing they're able to do to spin their agendas. Does not necessarily mean they're all religion, or minority conflicts. Okay. Now let's talk about minority rights. So within the minorities, this is very, so same thing you'll notice here. Here, the distribution is roughly 4 to 1, we said, 80% to 20%. Now among minorities, it's very interesting that minority is Muslims. So most of the issues you'll see being talked about will be from that angle, because they are the majority of the minority community. So you'll see more of that in the press, more of that in discussion, and it makes sense because they are the larger chunk of the minority part. But what's more interesting is, and you can see the distributions here, what is more interesting though is, this is where things get complicated and it becomes, there is no, sometimes people say, how come the minorities don't get together and figure out what to do with India? Well, here's one explanation. So what happens is, majority community or government of India, however you want to look at it, because they are the ones who end up voting them in power, they end up granting different minority rights to different minorities. Let me give you an example. And they play on the religion and the caste card again, because that's the dominant card. So for example, I'll use a Sikh example, most of you are Sikhs, and I'll use some other example if you want. Sikhs by doctrine don't have caste system, but we know people are practicing it. So what they've done is, if a Sikh says they belong to OBC, SC or ST, which really are, SC stands for scheduled caste, scheduled caste as they call them, STs are the scheduled tribes, and OBCs are other backward castes. Then they have special quotas for all sorts of things, including for admissions in the universities, for example. So guess what? If you say you are a Sikh, but if you say I'm an OBC Sikh, you get the advantage of that quota. But if you're a Christian, and a Christian says I'm a Dalit Christian, they don't get that advantage. So in case of Sikhs, they have made an exception. They're accommodating that element. Now let me give you another example. Sikhs want their own personal code. So they don't allow personal code for the Sikhs. They say for that part you are part of Hindus, but for Muslims they allow their personal code. What I'm trying to say here is, if all the minorities, this question of why don't they work together, why don't they have similar rights, because majority and minority politics is, every minority does not have the same special rights. They have seen which special right to give who. So obviously, let's say the Sikhs and Christians that don't belong in that sense, they're like, man, you are a Sikh, I'm a Christian, but they're giving you the Dalit rights, or the allotment, the quota rights for admission, but Christians don't get it. You can apply that, Muslims have their code, but Sikhs don't have their code. So Sikhs make a noise, hey, how come constitutionally I'm not recognized as a Sikh? How come they keep calling me Hindu? But to Muslims, they have given that right, they will recognize you as a Muslim. So different minorities get different rights, and this is what I'm trying to say here, that a legitimate discourse is not occurring. So discourse, even the platform for the discourse is skewed. Because they'll say we'll only discuss this with this minority and this with this minority, rather than saying there should be, how in the West we talk about universal suffrage and other things like that now, universal rights. So there is no discussion on what minorities should have the rights, they discuss which minority should have which right. So this becomes a bargaining power when you're trying to work with different minorities, and that's the sort of, so what it does is, it creates, really constitutionally or policy-wise, it creates a very complex equation. And that complexity plays out on a national scene. And the way it plays out is, you can see when any major bills come on the scene, and then they look at the regional parties' involvement, and whichever regional party is needed for it, they'll grant special permissions to those people. And that's how the minority and majority complex gets. You can almost say it becomes a very complex game, and most of us have one-liners on these things. Oh, they are like this, or they are like this, but we don't understand how the vote banks is being used on the basis of caste and the basis of minority politics among themselves. Okay, now let me talk about, this one is very hard to read because of the fonts, but I was just going to get into, it says prejudice and discrimination here. So what happens is, there are certain grievances from each minority community. I mean, there are grievances from majority community as well. That's what Bharat used to talk about before he died. But about me, What about the Maharashtrians, the true, as he looked at as being the Hindus of India, and Hindu as a political word there as he used it. What I was trying to say here was that whenever there's a discussion on minority rights, this is when you start to see labeling. So when, for example, if a minority community wants to talk about particular discriminatory practice, instead of discussing that, there will be a label that these guys want to create disability, they want to make India unstable. So if, for example, and I'll get into each of the communities how this card gets played, instead of having a discussion on the issue itself, for example, if Punjabis, I'm not even saying Sikhs here, want to have a discussion on how come the state decides the ceiling for how much they will pay for a quintal of wheat, which essentially state gets to decide how much you get paid to the farmer. Its free market doesn't decide that. State gets to pick this. So for example, something on the Indian side of Punjab, same wheat, might have 100x units, the cost, how much a farmer gets paid. Across the border, it might even be 300. But state sets the ceiling, and so if farmers want to discuss that, the discussion takes place in the confines of economic policies, it becomes Punjab issue, or it becomes Sikh farmer issue. And that's the kind of stuff I was trying to explain earlier, that instead of focusing on what the issue is, it gets superimposed as being a religious or a ethnic conflict. But before I talk about conflicts, let me talk about what the Constitution guarantees. These are some of the clauses which most people are not aware of. One is, the state shall not deny to any person equality before the law and shall provide equal protection for every person within the territory of India. Now, so it's guaranteed. But you'll notice in practice, it just disappears. Because of what I just talked about, the majority-minority dynamics, and other reasons as well. Here's another article, the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on grounds of religion, race, caste, gender, place of birth, etc. You know the reality. These are the grounds of discrimination. Openly you'll see. You'll see that I was born in UP. Yeah, this is Jhansi is the city I was born in. At the age of 12, I moved to India. And this is the area, maybe you've heard of, well, maybe you saw the movie, people watch more movies now, Bandit Queen. Shekhar Kapoor had made that, which was about Phulan Devi. And essentially the issue there was that because she belonged to quote-unquote low caste, she was gang raped so many times and nothing was being done about it. And at some point she picked up arms and he killed a bunch of people, those who were gang raping her. At some point she actually became a member of Congress, or what they call member of parliament in India. And at some point in her life, as a sitting MP, she was assassinated in the capital, and there's no inquiry to date. A sitting MP was assassinated. Why? No inquiry. Even at that time, I remember article came from Cambridge. M.S. Gill, the former Chief Commissioner of India, who was a Cambridge man, I suppose, and he wrote an article in Outlook magazine. He says, sitting here in Cambridge in my sabbatical, I'm thinking, I'm not in India, and a sitting MP has been killed, and forget inquiry, there haven't been even eulogies. This is the problem. So it's not a Sikh thing or a Muslim thing, it's a thing that people who don't have particular rights, nobody gives a damn about it. And we'll come to that quickly. No citizen shall, on the grounds of religion, race, or caste, be ineligible for or discriminate against in respect of any employment or office under state. Huge problem. Regionalism, this is practiced all the time, openly practiced. No person shall be deprived of his right of personal liberty, except, according to, point is, there are certain guarantees, in writing at least. Although the new challenge, which is what yesterday's New York Times said, it said, but India does not have unqualified freedom of speech, and this is part of the problem. They're all qualified. They'll say, as long as you don't do this, and those qualifications keep changing. They keep introducing new bills to qualify, and this Indian professor is arguing, you cannot have, this is what Salman Rushdie calls, India is going through cultural emergency. There have been other emergencies in India, so there's a cultural emergency, and it's not only tackled unless you have unqualified freedom of speech. And guess what, if you say certain things, they book you under particular acts, or they'll throw, some FIR on you, which is a first information report that you had so many kilograms of RDX in your car. How are you going to defend yourself? This is a common technique in India. And they're saying government practices this all the time. And unless there is an unqualified freedom of speech in India, they can never become a true democracy. And this is a major issue in India. Okay, now coming back, let's look at the realities. Minorities do not fully enjoy some of the basic fundamental rights, and basic point there is, and I'm going to talk about this. These words are very political, by the way. When I use these words, don't look at them being just religious words, because by very definition, some of them are very political. Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs have been targets of the Hindu fanatics, and it's gone the other way as well. Fanatics from other communities, including Sikhs, have been targets of others as well. Religious identity is the basis of the attacks. They say it as such. We are attacking you, whether it's the train or whether it's storming of particular temples. They actually use this word. We are attacking because you are doing this as your religious practice. Assault on right to life, freedom of expression, practice, preaching, etc., etc. In Christian cases, these things have happened. I remember reading an editorial in Indian Express by a governor who used to be DGP of Punjab, a Christian man, and he writes an editorial saying that he used to be DGP before KPS Gill, Julio Roberto, and after he retired, he came back and he used to write certain articles, and one of the articles he wrote after the Christian killings, I remember reading that, he says, for the first time I'm ashamed of being an Indian, and now finally understand the pain of the Sikh community in Punjab. Because guess what? Christian missionaries were being pulled and killed, and nobody was doing a damn thing about it. And one of the notorious cases was of Harinder Singh, if you remember, about 6-7 years ago. So the point is, this is something like that Anglican preach, or the old saying during the Nazi Germany era, that they came after the Poles, and I was in the Poles, so I didn't care. And they came after the Catholic, I was in the Catholics, so I didn't care. Then they went after the union worker, I was in the union worker, so I didn't care. And now they're after me, and if I would have just helped and gotten up to save other people, maybe they would have killed us, which was replying to the Jewish angle. And that's what happens quite a bit in India as well. People just sit, and it happens in other places in the world, but we are discussing India today, that different minorities don't speak up for particular rights, and there are exceptions, but as a general trend, only in the last 5-6 years you are now beginning to see maybe some integrated process where people are speaking up when it does not affect them, when it's affecting people at large. Okay. This is about the Christian idea. I'm sorry about the slides. I guess there's too much light here. You can't read it. But this is about the Christian killings. Now, what I was trying to say earlier was, in the 1950s, there was a presidential order to set up something called, eventually a Mandal Commission report had come out. What happened there was, the Christian, essentially, one of the big claims of Christians in India is that when an SC, which is a schedule, let's call them the low caste, when the low caste becomes Christian in India, they don't get particular rights. In fact, certain rights are taken away from them, which is pretty interesting stuff. As I mentioned, if a Sikh does the same thing, they get particular rights. For Christians, in some cases, there have been incidents where they have been literally killed for converting their religion, changing their religion. I know there's incentivization, I know there's a proselytization, and there are those things as well, but a state cannot allow its agencies to do that, and that's one of the Christian issues, that how come state doesn't protect, on the basis of religion, the idea if somebody wants to change their religion. And when they do change it, state actually takes away their economic rights, like the quotas and particular special grants for particular minority communities. Then we quickly talk about women. UN runs this campaign that 50 million women are missing in India. And it's, you can read this report, but essentially what this is saying is, I don't think I need to talk about this too much. You know this has been the news, and everyone's talking about this. The two biggest countries who violate their women are China and India. But today we are focused on India. I mean, can you imagine? 50 million means, just for your, you can put it in context, it's a combined population of the, as you can see, the US, Canada, and the Russian Federation. Combined, 50 million people are missing. You don't know what has happened to them, and they're women. They're missing just because. If you want to see a projection of this, I highly recommend watching a movie called Matrabhumi, where they show the attitude towards women. And if it continues like this, in the next 20 years, you won't even have women to get married to in certain parts of central India. And you know, in Punjab, this is a big issue as well. How the technology is being used to, for feticide, killing women before they're born or within 1 year of when they're born. It's a huge problem. And women rights issues, I mean, let me just use this. This cartoon I picked up from, there's a campaign in India going on called Cartoons Against Corruption. Can you imagine somebody actually telling you, you deserve to be raped because you dress like this? This is the stuff which is coming out by national leadership, by the President of India's son. They say statements like this. People who are religious heads are saying things like this. So there is a definite attitude problem. There is also, I'll give you an example. I was reading a report, Indra Jaising works, and she's one of the known lawyers in Delhi, and there are other lawyers who work on this. Madhu Kishore is another one. She puts out a journal called Manushi, and she talks about, you know, we talk about in the West, there is a problem between the pay scales of men versus women. She's saying even the rape law is written in such a vague manner that it's considered only rape if, you know, we are all adults here, that it's only a rape if there is actually like an intercourse. But if you use some other objects, they don't even consider that a rape. So guess what most people do? They use other objects when they're committing these things. She's saying we're dealing with archaic laws and they refuse to change these laws. But now it's coming more in limelight because in the information age, how much can you hide? You know, people are looking at these things and people who work on this are saying they're seriously, so there is an attitude thing which you can, at minimum you have to change the law. And then you have to enforce the law. And then you have to create liberal organizations which work to change the attitude. That's how things get done. At minimum, you have to create a law which does not allow this. Let me talk about the Dalit issues. I actually personally don't like to use the word Dalit because even that's a political word. I personally prefer to use the word Mool Nivasi, which means original inhabitants of India. Before the Aryans came and invaders came, people lived in India as well. And you know what average Indian thinks of them? We actually, in the colloquial idiom, they sometimes are called Rakshas, which means demons. It's really pathetic what we have done. And if you don't understand how this discrimination works, you can just look at this on this. This is partly a Madhu Simriti issue, but I don't want to make it only a religious thing. It's a political document. But this is Human Rights Watch writing. Let's look at it. It says, discriminatory and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment of over 165 million people in India has been justified on the basis of caste. The practice of untouchability relegates Dalits, or so-called untouchables, known in Indian legal parlance as SCs, to a lifetime of discrimination, exploitation and violence, including severe forms of torture perpetrated by state and private actors in violation of rights guaranteed by the convention. Everyone knows apartheid. People don't know about the legal apartheid which exists. You call Colin Gonsalves, he's a Supreme Court lawyer who puts out a magazine called Combat Law. Last year when I talked to him, he says he has 16,000 cases pending in Supreme Court defending Dalit women because they went to a well to fetch a water where they were not allowed. This is today's India. This is what is happening, you know, with Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and other areas as well. 16,000 cases he alone has. And this is Human Rights Watch, so every quote I have is from some international agency. These are some serious issues which are popping up. And anyway, let's move on to, this is regarding, I know it's a very political issue. I know Narendra Modi is probably the #1 candidate for Prime Ministership of India. But this is something we have to deal with. You know, the state which has gone, anyway, regardless, forget the politics of it for a second. Let's talk about, let's even forget Gujarat for a second. Because people might say it was provoked. Babri Masjid is where the Muslims are dealing with. Here is a report about an average Muslim. And you don't tell me average Muslim is also political and somehow they're part of the conspiracy to destroy India. India has the largest Muslim population, and this is what's going on. The roots of Muslim rage run deep in India, nourished by a long-held sense of injustice over what many Indian Muslims believe is institutionalized discrimination against the country's largest minority group. Muslim Indians have a shorter lifespan, worse health, lower literacy levels, and lower paying jobs. And to that toxic brew, the lingering resentment over 2002's anti-Muslim riots in the state of Gujarat. Now, let me bring politics into this. The politics is that there are riots in Gujarat, which again the word riot is not really the accurate one, but it should be pogroms or massacres or killings. Elections are held after it. The person who is implicated in that wins with the highest margins. This is very much akin to what happened with 6 in '84. The persons who were orchestrators of that violence in November, elections are held and Congress wins with the highest margins. In this case it's BJP, in that case it was Congress. This is akin to, you realize guys, what happened in Nazi Germany was also democratic. When they killed more Jews, they got more voted into power. So something is seriously wrong with this. I was looking at an interview of, and now he lives in New York, but at that time he was in New Delhi. One of the celebrated Indian authors who wrote an article called Ghosts of Mrs. Gandhi. Forgetting his name. Anyone knows the author's name? Anyway, he lives in New York now. If I recall, I'll talk about it quickly. But he says it. He says, I was a professor at JNU. And even it took me 10 years to talk about what happened. I can imagine the fear. And JNU, Joseph, you don't know, Jawaharlal Nehru University, is a leading leftist university of India. He says a professor at JNU is fearful to talk about this issue for 10 years. He says, average Indian, of course they're going to be fearful. This is the kind of stuff on anti-Muslim issues going on. In Punjab, Sikhs have their own set of issues related to Punjab, and one of them is a constitutional one. When Sikhs are born in India, their birth certificate says they're Hindus. This is a major problem. Sikhs don't want to be called Hindus, but they are constitutionally labeled Hindus. And there were certain promises which were made in 47s, they have been implemented. There's the issue of water, riparian laws, what they call it. What do you do with the water and where the water flows, which state is supposed to benefit from it. They are being violated. Indian law is being violated on riparian laws. Genocidal campaigns, Punjab has become, analogy I use now is what happened to Native Americans in America. Native Americans, Red Indians sometimes called. The First Nations is the politically correct word because they were the first ones to live there. They were essentially, they were given so much alcohol that they didn't know what to do with it, and they all disappeared for a while. Now they have a new identity which is popping up again in America. Same thing is going on in Punjab. There's so much alcohol where people don't want to talk about the issues, so they go to superficial discussions on what really has happened in Punjab. Anyway, but I want to talk about two emotional arguments Sikhs present, but actually it's more than emotional. So what people don't realize is when Sikhs give this kind of comments, and they are considered controversial leaders, when Indian freedom was in the making, most people who died to free India, 80% in gallows, in life imprisonment, death penalties were Sikhs. And they said we were freeing India. But once India got freed and their promises weren't implemented, the statements like this come. My country is free now, but my Panth, which is Sikh collective, is still slave. This is 69. And on purpose I'm showing this. Even in 51, the leader at the time, Sikh leader Master Tara Singh said, we simply had change of masters from white to black. So these resentments have been growing, and instead of taking care of a discriminatory practice, eventually in the 80s it gets blown up as being a religious conflict. Actually it was more economic conflict or a political conflict. But if you don't want to take care of it, then eventually you can spin it whichever way you want to. This is from Brad Adams from Human Rights Watch. And he's talking about India at large. This is what Arundhati Roy said on BBC 2 weeks ago. She said, or maybe it was 3 weeks ago, she basically said, why there is a rampant culture or culture of impunity in India. She was talking about the case in New Delhi, the rape case. She said, now the world is talking about this case. The reason it happens is because the Indian agencies do this everywhere. And people see it. And they say, if the police and army can get away with it, then why can't I get away with it? She said this on BBC. She said, I visit those families in Assam, in Kashmir, and in Narmada Valley areas where police and army are ordered to do this. So there's a culture of impunity which has serious implications. And part of that implication is what Human Rights Watch is talking about, that in a vibrant electoral democracy with an abysmal human rights record, India likes to tell the world it has a world-class legal system and it allows to solve its own problems. But the reality on the ground is far different. Killers and torturers in the army and police do their work with official protection, degrading the law and taking the shine off of India's claim to be an emerging world leader. Now is the time to repeal antiquated laws that protect abusers. So again, constitutional guarantees certain things, and this is Human Rights Watch saying it, not a propaganda mechanism of some minority in India. So that's why people say minorities say this. Well, Human Rights Watch is not a minority of India. They study conflicts. They took Bush to task. They wanted to fight to bring him to task on torture laws which have been introduced in America itself, waterboarding included. They are saying this. Brad Adams said this statement in New Delhi. He's not afraid to say this. He went there for a conference on human rights. And this is where he's made this statement. He says, this is our understanding of Indian laws. You guys are protecting the abusers. And you have to change those laws because you're essentially not just protecting, you're ordering them to do this. So you're creating a culture of impunity. And let me talk about this culture of impunity, which Amnesty talks about in Punjab. And then I'll move on to a couple of remedies. Now, you can read this there, but essentially one of the major issues of Punjab is there have been too many extrajudicial killings. So here I'm talking about all the state stuff. I know it's much more complex. There are other things which are going on, but today we are focused on laws and implementation of the laws, constitutional elements of it. Supreme Court of India has admitted this. Not now or a year ago, 7 years ago or 6 years ago. They admitted there were extrajudicial killings, but nobody has been reprimanded to date. They turned this to National Human Rights Commission, and if you superimpose this data, 2,097 people killed in 3 cremation grounds of Amritsar, then this becomes roughly 25,000 people in Punjab. And that's just one report of just one Singh Khalda. The guy a lawyer who produced this evidence, guess what? The SSP, which is Senior Superintendent of Police, or Mr. Sandhu, he eliminated him. He says if he can eliminate 25,000 people, it's very easy to make 25,001, and he was killed. The guy who presented this data. So, I mean, there is no militancy in this. There is no propaganda in this. This is the admitted stuff in Indian courts. Even then, nothing is being done about it. So again, even, some people say the laws are great, but yeah, what about the implementation of the laws? It's like the last commission, Nanavati Commission, which agreed that what happened in November '84 was an organized crime. They in fact used the word it was pre-planned, but they said we don't have the authority to bring anyone, to reprimand anyone. So they're admitting at least that's the progress, but the laws are still not being fixed to make them implementable. And this seems to be a huge problem from Punjab and other angles. I've talked enough about the culture of impunity, but essentially what this is saying is that India is violating its Indian law. India is violating international conventions on cruel crimes and torture. And I mentioned combat law. This is the Colin Gonzalez is the one who runs this organization that in India. He's become quite an expert on minority rights in India, and he's a Supreme Court lawyer. So this is not a propaganda man. This is a man who's fighting the battle in the courts. Okay, and he gives examples of other places. He says it happens in Punjab, in Jammu and Kashmir. There are a lot of fake encounters. Fake encounter essentially means you kill somebody because you don't like what they're presenting. So which means there's no free speech. It comes down to free speech. So because this person is talking about it, so they'll say, well, he's with the militants, and then you'll kill him, but in the news you'll say, actually there was a fight between militants and police. So fake encounter means there was no encounter, but it's a manufactured encounter. All right, so what are the remedies? Well, the number one thing is, so Indian constitution is based on these 3 principles according to the preamble to the constitution. So let's look at that. Who's going to disagree with this? Everyone agrees with that. Then how do you implement it? Implementation comes down to that if, this is my presumption here, if India wants to be modern, and have a just and humane political system, and actually truly present itself to the world as a multiracial, multicultural, multinational polity, then they really need to go back and revise the 1950 Constitution. And I have a couple of things in their legal framework I'm presenting here is that there was a lot of discussion. Look at the difference in 1862. So before British were even thinking they will have a free India, they were thinking about what kind of constitution India needs. And in this draft, there was much more mention about the protection of minorities. If you look at were there riots under the British on religious grounds, it was a rare phenomenon. They were actually trying to create some system, some order to the madness which was prevailing, or sometimes it was not prevailing but manufactured. So those of you who are interested, I'm recommending go read the draft which was presented in 1862. And one of the things is the minorities in the policy statements of Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress was known to make promises but never implement them. This is one of the major reasons why Muslim League was founded. Because they saw they promise it, when it comes to practice, they don't create those resolutions. This is what Sikhs feel, that the promises were made, but they were never implemented. So the Congress, Indian National Congress is today's Congress, but I'm using that more to describe that today's Indian judiciary, the jurists, the Indian civil services, Indian foreign services, they need to look at this thing, how to counter this stuff. And essentially the promises made to Sikhs were between 1929 and 8th August 1947. None of them have been implemented. They're available in Constituent Assembly meetings. Mr. Banerjee's book, who has detailed exactly when what was promised, just haven't been implemented. And this seems to be a major problem of those who studied Sikh issues. They side with the promises between these years. Okay, this is not my garden. I'm just taking this from public thing. Actually, after this is India's logo, Satyamev Jayate. In fact, some of you maybe saw a program which Amir Khan started of the same name. And he was highlighting this. And the program, he was highlighting basically cultural, business, legal practices in India which were full of corruption. Guess what happened to his program after the first season? Any guesses? It doesn't exist anymore. Why doesn't it exist anymore? No sponsorship. So you can't even have it. I mean, the program which Indians were glued to it. It became like a #1 show in India because it was highlighting serious problems for Indians, as Indians. Businesses got tired of it, they put the plug, they're like, shit man, this guy's highlighting and we'll have to fix these things. Anyway, and during those days, that same campaign which runs campaign against corruption, then they develop this. He's like, the truth never wins in India, the corruption wins in India every single time. And that seems to be a trend which average Indian is now talking about. They're like, the I in India needs to be the person, me. And they never talk about me, they talk about particular elitists. Whether they happen to be the right-wing parties of India or the left parties of India, it always comes down to elitist protection, never the average Indian's protection. So, what can Indian government really do about this? Well, one of my recommendations as I look at this is there is no accountability of security forces in India. They actually have blanket check, they can do anything. These kind of things, if they happen freely, they happen a little bit in the West, not a little bit, they happen quite a bit in the last 80 years, let's say in the West, including Canadian forces were known to do tortures, working with the American counterparts and British counterparts. Guess what? World knows about it. They're trying to drag them to courts. A Libyan leader who was fighting for Libyan independence, he came on the scene and says, I was taken on a British plane to Thailand to torture. And on the very same day, Mrs. Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, got on the plane and came to see him in Paris. Point is, they're trying to deal with it. But in India, there is still a denial, we don't do it. In fact, the current Prime Minister of India was sent to a Vienna conference in 1993. Back then, he was a finance minister. He stood in that conference and said, he says, there have never been any human rights violations against Sikhs in India. So, that's a baloney from any angle. From any angle. You don't even have to listen to Sikhs. You look at it. Physicians for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Bellevue Hospital report, they all agree that there have been a torture. I worked on a project in India, in Punjab for 5 years, on a grant from UN Subcommittee on Torture for the rehabilitation of torture victims. But there is still a denial. So obviously you're not going to fix anything if there's going to be a denial. So accountability, and this, by the way, any human rights lawyer will tell you, until this is what a truth commissions do for UN or in South Africa. It is less about punishing the guilty, but at least establishing the record this happened. And this is how you move on as a country. Otherwise, if you really want to develop India to be its the multicultural and multi-polity model, it's never going to go there because people have a lot of resentments. And they come out in more uglier forms. And that's why you'll notice the kind of quote-unquote riots which occur in India. They occur in other parts of the world, but they occur more frequently in India. Protect and support vulnerable communities, and which is Dalits, tribal groups, religious minorities, and women. Indian government, including the Prime Minister, is on record in his last major address to the nation that the #1 threat to India right now is Maoists. And if you ask any Maoist leader, they say our #1 issue is we are not given equal rights. They're tribals. So obviously religious ideologies are picked up and they are fighting, and they are now fighting and killing police because police is going and killing them. They're like, yeah, he said, our #1 issue is tribals don't have rights. They don't have economic rights. And this, according to Indian government, is a #1 issue. And what is the issue? Economics. Not having fundamental equal rights. So there needs to be some protection on that, and constitutional legal safeguards. Now let me quickly talk about why is this important to Sikhs. It's important to everyone, but Sikhs have been presented as being troublemakers in India. And I look at it as being, this is part of being, if somebody says they're a Sikh, they are going to be troublemaker. And we were troublemaker. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Gadar movement. Gadar movement was founded by Sikhs. It had non-Sikhs as well, Barkatullah was part of it, a lot of South Indians are part of it. But it was headed by Kartar Singh Saraba. He was a University of Berkeley, California student. He went to India to free India. The guy who founded it was Lala Hardayal with Sohan Singh Pakhana. Sohan Singh Pakhana used to travel from Germany, all of Europe, some parts of Asia, all the way to Canada to round up people to go fight the British. And 80% of people who joined this movement were Sikhs. And Kartar Singh Saraba went back to India to fight for Indian freedom. Age of 19, they hanged him. This is part of Sikh DNA, that's what I'm trying to say. And you can read Puran Singh's quote. He basically says if somebody says he or she is a Sikh, they don't have an option but not to fight for these rights. Even when India had emergency, when Mrs. Gandhi, and this is not about her, but she's the one who declared emergency in 70s, no political party objected to her. Individuals did, including the union leader at the time, George Fernandez, but no political party objected to what she was doing. Sikh political party did, the Khalis, whatever they might be, and they were punished for it eventually. So this is part of Sikh DNA. This is why Sikhs, as much as the labels are used to denounce them, whenever it doesn't suit the Indian politics, Sikhs become Pakistanis and terrorists. But whenever it suits us, we become the heroes. When they need us in army, like even recently, even Amir Khan produced this video. I don't know if you saw that. It came out a month and a half ago, where this Australian girl is traveling on a 3-wheeler in India. She basically sends a letter to him, but he makes a 1.5-minute movie out of it. And this girl is traveling in 3-wheeler, and 2 guys in the 3-wheeler are, they try to molest her. And a Sikh guy comes and they slaps the hell out of her and takes her. So she's writing, thanks to this Indian, Sukhwinder Singh, I think the name was, that I wasn't raped. So Sikhs are not against, as I understand doctrinally, against India or a particular party in India, but they do have a huge sort of a religious, even a spiritual element that we want to fight against all sorts of discriminatory laws. And this has been the history of Sikhs in the last 500 years. So, and Puran Singh is talking about that. He says Sikhs are least interested in whether they will win the battle or not. They're more interested in fighting the battle. And you'll notice this, sometimes even Sikhs themselves make fun of Sikhs. Well, that they're not understanding the Sikh doctrine. Sikh doctrine says you don't have to win the battle, but you cannot accept indiscriminatory practice, whether it's against Sikhs, Punjabis, Hindus, Indians, and this is why the Sikh history is within the last 100 years, they fight for all freedoms. They freed their gurdwaras, they freed India, they died for protecting India, they still do, but they also fight for people's right, whether it's in Kashmir or in Punjab and other places as well. So my submission today was that India is has never gone through the national integrated process. Because it hasn't, it has created catered solutions for particular minorities, and it uses those against each other minorities. If India seriously wants to celebrate its women and its religious and ethnic and gender minorities, then it needs to fix few things in Indian constitution itself, but more importantly, it needs to it basically needs to counter the culture of impunity. And Sikhs become and remain, and I hope they remain, the major players to counter this culture of impunity. Any questions?